So I'm going to continue, as you know, I started a little series on looking at various stories from the life of King David. And we looked last week at his anointing and just a few lessons from that. And this morning we're going to look at probably what I suppose is the most famous of all the stories about King David, which I guess there are probably very few passages of the Bible that are very well known outside the church, but people know of David and Goliath and giant killing, and we still use those phrases in our culture, even though they might not know where they come from, maybe, but they talk of giant killings and, this is a David and Goliath fixture, as some non-league team tries to take on a Premier League team. So I suppose that makes it, in a way, we know this story so well that the challenge is actually getting to allow God to speak to us afresh with it. So that's my prayer this morning, that He speaks to us anew in this amazing, story that we all know from. If you went to Sunday school anyway, you probably know it. But yeah. So as last time, I'm going to read it in. It's a long story, a long chapter, quite a lot of verses. So I'm going to read it in chunks and not all at once. So we're going to start off with verses 1 to 16. So the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socco in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socco and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. And a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits, that's about, in my old money, about 9.5 feet, something like that. And a span, so 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. I don't know what that is, but it's quite a lot, it's heavy. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. And Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. So we have to begin with facing giants. That's what they're doing here. It's interesting that the valley of Elah, where Goliath would come and stand with the Israelites on one side and the Philistines on the other, sort of, you may imagine a sort of valley. And the valley's name means mighty tree, the valley of the mighty tree. And I guess that as Goliath stood there and planted himself, as it says in the passage, he looked like a mighty tree, really. And you think, whoa, how can we possibly do anything with that? How can we fight this man? Now, I always think with these passages, we're meant to think, okay, well, where have we met giants before? That's a good question, isn't it? Where have we met giants before? And the answer is, of course, in Exodus, when the Israelites reached the edge of the promised land and they sent out their scouts. And the 12 scouts and came back and 10 of them said, "Well, there's giants in the land. these Anakim. And it's thought that Goliath is probably a descendant of that race of giants. And do you know what happened in that story? There was just Caleb and Joshua that said, look, we can take these giants on. But fear prevailed, and they spent 40 years in the wilderness. Now, isn't it interesting that 40 days has passed? You know, there's the Bible writers are very clever and cute, and they link these things. And so, like the 40 years of wandering in the desert because they wouldn't take on the giants, so Israel have had 40 days and nights of Goliath coming out and challenging them and doing nothing because they're afraid. It's going right back to... And it's interesting to me that Goliath's name actually means exile. And in a sense, what's happening is that he's making this challenge, you know, let's do this one-to-one battle. And it's apparently happened in ancient history sometimes, rather than the whole armies fighting. Two champions would fight, and whoever won would be the victor. And he says, doesn't he, that, you know, if I win, then you will be my slaves. Where is slavery? It's exile. That was exile in Egypt, later exile in Babylon. Exile, it means slavery, and that's what Goliath is saying. We've come into your land and we're going to take you as our slaves. So that's the challenge. And the Israelites, and Saul in particular, Saul, who we know was a head taller than anyone else, you know, he's kind of the one that should be out there, but he's just as scared as all the others because the Spirit has left him, as we read last time. So I guess the first question is, I can't remember when I put this on the thing, but yeah, I did. What are your giants? What are your giants? And I guess for us, we don't very often have to face a 9.5-foot guy in armour, but we do face giants. And I guess the giants for us is anything that is too big for us to manage in our own strength. Anything that we look at and think, well, this is too much for me, and I'm afraid of it. And it intimidates us. Now that can be, depending on our circumstances, loads of different things. It can be a relationship that's gone sour. It can be our financial position and situation. It can be redundancy. It can be our job and things that are happening within our job, whether it's something we're being asked to do that seems just out of our skill set and we can't manage, or just a workload situation that is too much for us. Or it's somebody at work who's just like, how can I deal with this person, my boss, or whoever it might be. It might be past mistakes that really loom so large, and they're like a giant, and we think nothing can ever conquer that. You know, what went on in the past, whether that's something done to us or something that we've done. It can be a health situation. It can be stepping into our calling when God calls us to do something and we think, that's too big for me. Whether it's just some praying for somebody even, or sharing our faith with somebody, or whether it is, you know, a particular ministry. Whatever it is, often those things just seem far too big for me. I can't do that. It can be the addiction, or it can be a task. Loads of different things can be our giants. And I guess the challenge is how do we face that? How do we face the giant for us? Whatever it is in our life that at the moment is our giant, how do we face it? Do we run? Do we hide? Or do we face it in faith? We'll come back to that. But not only is David facing a giant, he's also facing a snake. The writer of 1 Samuel 17 is very interested in Goliath's armour. Very unusually, really. He describes it in detail, and he says it was like an armour of scales. And commentators have really drawn attention to this, because it's unusual for writers in the Bible to really give much detail about armour, but he does. He's got this scale-like armour, and he's standing as the snake that is against the people of God. He's a representation of the power of evil standing against the kingdom. And again, that flips me back to Eden, when the snake comes, and Adam fails that test, when the snake comes and challenges him. It's interesting to me that this happens as well just after David has been anointed with the Spirit. And as we go into the story, we'll find that David is called to take on the snake, and he's just been anointed. And Jesus, in the same way, when the Spirit fell on him like a dove at the River Jordan, what happens to him immediately after that is he's taken into the wilderness to face the snake. And in Revelation, the picture of evil and the evil powers is like the dragon, the serpent that comes out of the sea. I know it's a vision, but that's the picture. And often in biblical language and biblical way, this is the power of evil. So we are called to face our giants, but we're also called to face the snake, not in our own strength, as I'll say, but we are called to fight the powers that are against God's people and against us. We're in a battle, and just as David was and the Israelites were, we are in a battle. That battle may come in the form of temptation, that subtle voice that says, do that, tell that lie, it won't matter, or whatever it might be. Or it might be that voice that just says compromise your faith. Don't stand for Jesus. Come on. Nobody does that these days in this day and age. Come on. What are you thinking? That little seed of doubt, just give it up, give it away. Or if you do stand for him, just do it very, very quietly, and don't mention it to too many people, and tone it down. Or maybe it's just that the snake comes in the form of that cultural magnet that we see in our advertising and all the rest of it that says, just follow the world's way. Don't be different. So there's loads of ways in which we too are called to fight the snake. Okay. Let's go on a bit more in the story. Verse 17. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of the unit and see how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They're with Saul and with all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines." No, they're not really, but I like the way that the writer puts all this in the story. They're not really fighting at all, but not at this moment anyway. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Yeah. So I just want to say something about the power of fear and intimidation. Because there's no doubt that's a major part of this story. That the nation, that the Israelite army is just absolutely intimidated. So what happens is, of course, paralysis. There's this kind of just nothing happening. They're so afraid they can't do anything. Reminds you sort of the animal in the headlights. And sometimes that's how it is with us when we are afraid of the giant, whatever it is, that we just become paralysed with fear of that, and we just can't do anything. And what we also see is that they have a wrong focus. The Israelite army has a wrong focus. Their focus and attention is all on the giant, and they've forgotten God. Whereas when David comes along, as we'll see in the story in a minute, his focus is somewhere completely different. And that's what happens with our fears. So often they can be the sole focus of our attention. And we forget that our God is bigger than anything. His name is bigger than any of the fears that we have, or any of the situations we face, whatever it might be. He is always bigger. But for the Israelites at the moment in their fear, as Goliath stands there, he's the biggest thing they can see and think of, and is kind of focusing their mind. It's interesting that it says that he comes out day and night to stand, in the morning and in the evening, he comes out and defies them. And it's like that whole focus of life, every part of day, the morning and the evening. And you know how sometimes when you're worried about something, it can become like that. It becomes something that dominates your thinking. In the morning, in the evening, you can't sleep, all the rest of it. And so, basically, they turn in fear, and discouragement and surrender is what happens. And there's a sense almost in which they're actually worshipping Goliath, the Israelite army. I read this recently and it struck me that actually when we are more afraid of something than we are of God, then we're actually worshipping it because we're saying that thing is bigger than God can deal with. And that's never true. So I don't want to worship Goliath. I don't want to worship the thing that's big. I want to worship the God who is the God of the angel armies. I mean, I suppose the question, I don't know, again, did I put this up? Oh, yeah. There you go. There's my points on that. But the question is, how much time do you spend in fear? How much time do you spend worrying? How much time do I spend? It's a question for myself. All of this is for me too. My aspiration is that nothing will make me afraid. That's my aspiration. I'm not there by any means, but that's my aspiration, that nothing will make me afraid because I know the power and the presence of the God who loves me and cares for me. So that's, the power of fear. Then he goes on, now the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. You see how Saul's copying out here. He's saying, I can't just, anybody, I'll do all this if somebody will just go out and fight this guy. And David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. And when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Now what have I done? Said David. Can't I even speak? I love this brother sort of relationship stuff going on here. Never happens in real life, does it? But now what have I done? Oh, sorry, I've done that bit. He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man and he's been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armour on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I can't go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. I love it again, just the sense of humour. We know that Saul is taller than anyone else by a head, anyone else in Israel, and there's David, this sort of 15-year-old teenager, still just a boy. And you imagine this scene of him trying to wear Saul's armour and it's too long and can't move. So that brings me to the obstacles David faced. First of all, there was his brother. his brother who discourages him said, "What are you doing here? You're just here to gloat or to, who do you think you are? You can't do this. Go back to your sheep. You're just a lad." And some of us, we have perhaps known some of that discouragement, either from teachers, people in authority, sometimes family, sometimes even other people in the church. You can't. Yeah, what are you playing at? You can't possibly do this. You're not qualified. You're not able. You're too inexperienced. So he faces his brother. Faces the discouragement of Saul. He says, you're just but a lad. He's a bit more gentle with him than his brother, but you're just a lad. This guy, Goliath, he's been trained as a warrior since his youth, and he's been fighting all his life. You can't possibly do it. And then he faces the obstacle of Saul's armour, which just doesn't fit. It's not him. He can't possibly do it in that armour. And sometimes, we do try and wear somebody else's armour. We try and be like somebody else, or we try and do something in the way that they do it. And it doesn't work. We try and take on something that we know is not really us. It's not in our gifting. It's not in our strength. And knowing when it's Saul's armour is a key thing to growing into maturity. Knowing when, actually, this just isn't me. I've got to say no to this. I'll never get anywhere doing this because it's not what I'm called to do or be or to be like. And I think one of the most freeing things is realising that actually I can just take all that off like David did. And so I don't need all of that. I don't need it. And knowing that God can use us as we are, as each one is who we are. We don't need to be somebody else. And we can all just do it in the way that we need to do it. So David faces a few obstacles before he can get to taking on Goliath, his brother Saul, and Saul's armour and sword. So then we get to the interesting bit. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. And David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. It gets a bit gruesome at the end, but it's the Old Testament. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. And the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and the gates of Ekron. That's their leading cities. Their dead were strewn along the Sharim road to Gath and Ekron. And when the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. So David turns out to be the champion. He's the champion of Israel. We know that Goliath He's described as the champion of the Philistines. And an Old Testament commentator has remarked the fact that the word champion that's used in the passage there actually means literally the man of the between. That's what it means, the man of the between. And it's David who stands as the man between the enemies and Israel. He's their representative. And again, this reminds me of someone else, Jesus. David is always reminding us of Jesus. He's a pointer to Jesus. Jesus is our champion. He's our representative. And he stood between the forces of evil and took it on for us. And we won the victory through him. This story all hangs on David. Our story all hangs on Jesus. And I think an interesting question. So he's a forerunner of Jesus, our champion. Who are we meant to be in the story? And sometimes, yeah, we are called to be like David and take on the giant. But actually, I think mostly we are like the Israelite army, and we just follow him. We just clear up after Jesus has won the victory. He's our champion. I just picture all of the Israelite army suddenly gathering courage, gathering strength, and they're off, and they're chasing off the Philistines. That's us. And that is because the battle is always the Lord's, as David rightly said in verse 47. He seems to have this faith and confidence in God, that it's not in his own ability. As he said, it's not by sword or something obvious. He just has this amazing confidence in God and his power and his goodness, and the battle is never ours. And I was reminded of, we sang that passage of song the Lord is my shepherd this morning. And of course, Psalm 23, which David wrote. And in that passage, he talks about the valley of the shadow of death. And I wonder whether he may have been thinking of something else, but I wonder sometimes whether he's thinking of this. He's in the valley. There's this shadow of this guy, Goliath, and he's walking into the shadow of death. But he says, even in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. His rod and his staff, they comfort me. And David must have been really in this moment, in a moment of peace, as he goes forward to face Goliath. He must have been, because you can't get your sling out and aim your rock towards his head if your hands are shaking. You can't. If your hands are shaking, if you try archery or something, or firing a gun, I hope you haven't, but if you do, or anything, if you're shaking, it's going to go all over the place. So David seems to be perfectly at peace, because even in the valley of the shadow of death, he fears no evil. So David is our champion. Jesus is our champion. And we can fight our battles because he has already won. And lastly, let me just briefly ask you about what are the weapons that we fight with. Because David doesn't use the obvious weapon. He uses something very unusual, a stone. It wasn't the obvious thing to use in battle. But there's one weakness in Goliath's armour, and he finds it with it. So what are the weapons that we fight with? Paul says in 2 Corinthians, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So we fight like Jesus. He is our champion, our hero, as I've said. And if you're learning, Roger will know this, if you're learning a martial art, then you go to the master, don't you, to learn how to go through the various levels of the martial arts, whether it's judo or taekwondo, whatever it is. You go to the master. I'm old enough to remember that series when there was a guy who used to go to a guru, and he used to say, grasshopper, He was the martial art, you remember it. And he used to give him the wisdom as to what to do. And, to fight our battles, to fight our giants, to fight the snake, we look to Jesus. He's the master. He's the master of our battles. And he uses weapons which are a bit weird as well, like the stone was for David. He uses weapons that are a bit weird. Weapons like faith. So we fight our fears through faith and through trust. We fight with the truth. Jesus was always, when he was tested in the wilderness, he quoted the truth to the enemy. And so we too fight with the truth. That's why it's so important to know the Bible, because we fight with it. We fight with what's true about ourselves, not the circumstances around us. It's not those that dictate. It's not the culture. It's the truth of who we are in Christ. We fight often with sacrifice, which is completely nonsensical to the world. But we lay down things, and victory comes through the laying down. We fight through goodness. We fight through giving kingdom blessing, even to our enemies. Even to our enemies, we pray for them. We bless them. We heal them. We love them. We fight with prayer. I can't remember if there's any more. No, that's it. And we fight also with hope in our hearts, because we always hope in the one who's won the victory for us. So look, I'm definitely done.